Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers. Back with me in the studio as ever, we have Spike's editor, Tom Slater.
Hello.
And joining us down the line from Brussels, from the Academy of Ideas, it's Jacob Reynolds.
Thanks for having me.
We've got loads to talk about today. We'll be discussing the creep of Islamic blasphemy laws into Europe, the betrayal of Ukraine, and the release of the Israeli hostages. Tom, before we get onto that, do you want to tell us a bit about Spike's 25th anniversary?
Yes, so we're celebrating our 25th birthday at the moment, and to celebrate, we are pushing our donation drive, our anniversary donation drive, whereby if people donate £25 or more, they can get a year's membership to Spike Supporters. Spike Supporters is our online donor community. It's where people can read the site ad-free, they can comment on the articles, they can come to exclusive events. And for £25, that's half the usual annual price. So if you want to donate to us to make sure we're around for at least another 25 years, do go to spiked-online.com/donate. And importantly, if you're already a Spike supporter but you want to benefit from this offer, if you do go to the donate page, pay your £25, we'll extend your membership by a year. So yeah, spiked-online.com/donate. Help us celebrate.
So, are we seeing the creeping spread of Islamic blasphemy laws to Europe and to the UK? I mean, there's been two cases recently where people have been charged in Britain for burning the Koran. Particularly gruesome case recently in London where someone was actually stabbed at for doing this. And the victim was also arrested along with the person allegedly doing the stabbing. Tom, can you unpack this for us?
No, this is really alarming. I mean, in the space of a couple of weeks, we've seen 2 arrests, and in one case of full-blown prosecution for the burning of a Quran. There was the case in London, as you've already described, which was outside the Turkish consulate, suggesting that it may have been a kind of political stance as much as anything else. The other one was in Manchester, where a gentleman took to the streets and began burning a Quran whilst live streaming, I believe. And he's actually already pleaded guilty to racial and religiously motivated public order offences, effectively. That's the charge that has been laid in both cases. The other case from London is ongoing. This is not entirely new. I mean, at least to my knowledge, back in 2011, there was an EDL member who was prosecuted under similar offences for taking a Quran from a library and then burning it as part of a stunt. So it's not that this has never happened before, but I think the fact that they've happened in such quick succession, the fact that it comes off of the back of moves in Scandinavia to criminalise the burning of Qurans. In fact, the one in Manchester was in response to the Iraqi refugee who was actually killed whilst he was awaiting to stand trial for his own Quran burnings. Tells you that there is a kind of a context at the moment where we're seeing Western governments moving towards the criminalisation of Quran burning. In the case of Denmark and Sweden, who have had a huge controversy where this is concerned in recent years, they're moving to kind of introduce new laws or to tighten up the laws that they have. Here it seems like we're taking our existing public order legislation and applying it to this kind of stunt. But it's really incredibly alarming. I think when we've spoken about the kind of backdoor blasphemy laws in the UK in recent years, that's often been the way in which there's been a turning of a blind eye to instances in which there was intimidation of people, threats issued to people when they were seen to blaspheme against Islam in one way or another. That was kind of mainly where the debate was. The fact that we're now seeing a much more concerted effort on the part of police and the CPS to use our existing hate speech legislation effectively to clamp down on this shows that it's kind of pincer movement now, and that if people don't start speaking up about this is just going to become the norm before we realise it.
Yeah, Jacob, I mean, it's just incredibly alarming, isn't it, to see... We thought we'd abolished blasphemy laws. Officially in the UK, the last blasphemy laws went in 2008, but under the guise of hate speech, potentially new rules around Islamophobia could come in. What you can say about Islam is increasingly curtailed.
Well, it seems to be the kind of coming together of two of the more dangerous, worrying, and pernicious trends in contemporary society, which is one, the criminalization of speech under the grounds of offense and the elevation of people's feelings above our kind of democratic rights, and the small but very vocal and seemingly influential moment of radical Islamism. And the coming together of these two strands in a kind of match made in hell is very, very worrying, because it does take society in a direction that I don't think most people would want to go in, which is to say that there is one, in this case, is one class of people, particularly motivated Islamists, whose beliefs get to be above reproach. And everybody knows the kind of indignities that are heaped on ordinary people every day for daring to criticize various aspects of life. But there's only one belief that is actually protected, it seems, and that's if you hold some kind of radical Islamist view. And those two coming together is very, very dangerous. I think I'd go a little bit further, to be honest, than some commentators I say, where lots of people seem almost apologetic to stand up for these people who burn Qurans. They go out their way to say, yeah, well, we shouldn't be nasty to people on purpose. We shouldn't roast the kind of deliberately offend people. And whilst that's true, the context means that I think it's almost, you can understand why in the context where laws are passed, people are killed, intimidated for this, it becomes an act of resistance to take to the streets and to engage in some act that in normal circumstances you would just dismiss as being kind of grossly offensive for no purpose. But in the context, it almost becomes a kind of as something of an act of rebellion to stand up and say, no, I will slay this idol that people say we can't criticize.
Yeah, and Tom, I mean, it's been 10 years since the Charlie Hebdo killings. Mm-hmm. Famously, people were slaughtered for publishing cartoons of Muhammad. Back then, there was at least a lip service being paid to free speech. There was a whole Je suis Charlie movement. Today, we see barely nothing from the political class or from the cultural elites in defence of people burning the Koran and their right not to be stabbed while doing so, or their right not to be arrested for doing so.
No, absolutely. I mean, that there was no backlash at all, really. It's been like that for some time now. If you think about the way in which Batley Grammar was handled, the way in which you had local Labour politicians, in which even the then Tory government effectively saying that the school had made the right decision in terms of suspending the teacher, essentially siding with the people who were pummeling him with death threats and saying that it was completely outrageous that in a religious studies class about freedom of expression you might show them some Charlie Hebdo cartoons. But that's been baked in now for some time, regrettably. Yeah. I think one thing, I completely agree with Jacob as far as this is, I find it odd to even kind of engage in, now of course what they did was offensive when you're talking about someone who was very nearly stabbed to death outside the Turkish consulate. If you think about someone like Hatton Tash, who is a ex-Muslim, now kind of Christian preacher, who's spent a lot of her time at Speaker's Corner getting into arguments with various people, and who was also slashed at with a knife. There was also a terror plot, a gun plot to kill her, and yet in a context like this, there's no point doing any kind of throat clearing and talking about how offensive someone might have been, because in her case she was wearing a Charlie Hebdo t-shirt. Yeah, is obscene when you look at it like that. But I imagine a big part of the silence, the unwillingness to address this, there is obviously a section of the liberal left who have found themselves kind of in agreement with the Islamists, but for slightly different reasons. They have come to see people who wish to blaspheme against Islam as effectively racist. They're doing it for ignoble reasons, and a clamp down on that kind of speech is sort of positive in a kind of multicultural society. There is an element of that. But I think the other thing is that there's just an element of cowardice and the kind of sense that if we do not clamp down on this kind of behaviour, it's a threat to the it's a threat to basically kind of public order. Yeah. Which is obvious, which was always actually one of the key arguments for having blasphemy laws. It was the idea that it would cause too much trouble, it would cause too much unrest, either to the general social order, but also just in the streets. I think it's clear that the precise opposite is true. The more that you indulge this kind of intolerance and hysteria, the more it's going to build. It's worth saying that in a country like Pakistan, which not only has its own blasphemy laws, but also has an incredibly hysterical and violent climate of anti-blasphemy activism, which has resulted in people being attacked, killed, and so on, which is far and away and ahead and much more zealotry than what exists on the statute book. And incidentally, actually, a lot of the kind of blasphemy scandals that we've had in the UK have often had connections with the kind of anti-blasphemy movements in Pakistan itself, incidentally. But Pakistan, I think, is a perfect example of the fact that, you can crack down on this stuff, but it doesn't mean that insane intolerance, that kind of medieval fury against someone who has deigned to offend your religious sensibilities, it's not going to go away. If anything, you kind of feed it, you tolerate it, you acquiesce to it. And the fact that we're going down a kind of similar road, albeit in a less dramatic, quieter fashion, I think is dangerous from the perspective of public order and keeping people safe as much as anything else.
And the Sweden case, I mean, proves that. Salwan Mimika, being charged with this, awaiting trial. The Swedish government is obviously not, is not theocratic government. It's not minded to necessarily want to preserve the dignity of Islam, but it does think that it will keep people safer if it bans blasphemy, and that clearly hasn't happened.
Yeah, and the point here is that if you concede the principle that in our society we're going to have certain areas, religious areas, for example, that are off limits for criticism, then you bring that society into being. So you go from a society where you can criticize things to out of maybe good intentions, maybe because of the activism of Islamists in certain areas, whatever. But before you know it, you're in a society where people just think it's normal that you shouldn't criticize certain areas, and that suddenly a whole kind of realm, hard fought for rights, which are really crucial to the development of the West, and particularly the religious freedoms that marked the evolution in parliamentary democracy in the UK, that suddenly overnight you live in a very, very different society, and also makes it more difficult to integrate newcomers who may, for whatever reason, come from some culture or some society where this is maybe a more normal, natural, accepted part of life. But one of our jobs in the UK is to say that you come to the UK, we might do things slightly differently here. And if the state and the police are so not even just apologetic, but actively happy in enforcing these laws, and you kind of give succor to some of these more regressive elements in certain communities that we already know we have a problem with.
And it's one of the things that makes it so perverse that this gets presented. It's almost kind of racist to stand up for people's right to blaspheme against Islam, that it's kind of bigoted and anti-Muslim. Shows that people are entirely ignorant of this particular issue. Anti-blasphemy activism, whether that's in the UK or whether that's abroad in Muslim-majority countries, is often targeted primarily at dissenting Muslim sects, Christians as well, of course. But in Pakistan, it's very much preoccupied with the Ahmadi Muslim sect, which is seen as heretical by many Muslims because it doesn't believe Muhammad was the final prophet. And also in the UK, to my knowledge, the only two kind of Islamic blasphemy-related murders which have taken place over the course of certainly since the year 2000 have been, one was an Ahmadi Muslim, another was another dissenting Muslim cleric. So to act as if this is all about just the white Brits' right to sound off about Islam is completely missing what's going on here. It's often primarily ex-Muslims, members of dissenting Muslim sects, as I say, and liberal Muslims who get thrown under the bus when you allow these medieval restrictions on speech to creep in.
This episode is brought to you by Incogni, the easy way to take back control of your personal data. Now, you might not know, but there are loads of companies out there that you've never heard of that have access to your personal information. Data brokers are buying and selling your address, your name, even your browsing history, all without you knowing. That's why you get all those annoying phishing emails, those spam telephone calls and spam texts. But there is a way you can put a stop to it with Incogni. Incogni automatically contacts these data brokers on your behalf, demanding they remove your personal information. And if they refuse, Incogni handles that too. Instead of spending hours figuring out which companies have your data and filing requests yourself, Incogni does it all for you. But it doesn't stop there. Incogni keeps working in the background, constantly scanning and resubmitting removal requests to make sure that your data stays private. You'll get fewer annoying calls, fewer scam attempts, more peace of mind. You'll know that your information isn't floating around for anyone to buy. And if you had to do this yourself, it would take months. By the time you were done, new brokers would have picked up your data all over again. Incogni makes it effortless. Just sign up, give them a green light, and let them handle the rest. You'll even get updates so you can see how much of your data is being erased. If you want to keep your loved ones safe too, Incogni's plan lets you add up to 4 others for the same protection. And with a 30-day trial and full money-back guarantee, you can try it risk-free. Take control of your personal data today. Just go to incogni.com/spiked to get 60% off an annual plan. That's incogni.com/spiked, or click the link in the description. So the US policy towards Ukraine has essentially turned on a dime in the past couple of weeks. Last week we heard about Donald Trump having a phone call with Vladimir Putin, setting up the peace talks. Those talks began in earnest in Saudi Arabia with no Ukrainian involvement. Since then, we've had Donald Trump essentially sounding off about Volodymyr Zelensky, calling him all kinds of names, suggesting he's a dictator, suggesting he's an illegitimate ruler, and even that Ukraine started the war. Tom, is Trump suffering from Zelensky derangement syndrome, perhaps?
I mean, it has been striking how in the past, certainly 24, 48 hours, it's he's very much kind of taking his lead from that section of Trump world, that section of the American right, which has become anti-Ukraine to a kind of cartoonish and conspiratorial degree. Things like he hasn't said this directly, but the kind of idea that Zelensky is basically kind of on the take, that he's this sort of welfare queen of global affairs, this kind of misconception that what's happened with US military aid is that almost like pallets of cash are showing up in Kiev, and Zelensky's pocketing half of it goes to some other dodgy oligarch and they carry on. It's absurd, but that's one thing that's been doing the rounds. This sort of thing his son says on social media, that's been there for a while. This idea that Zelensky's a dictator because of the fact that it's actually quite difficult to hold an election during a war, which has been doing the rounds, unfortunately. And I think as soon as we saw that delegation in Riyadh where you had the Americans suddenly raising the issue alongside the Russians of the need for elections in Ukraine, was a bit of a tell that particular kind of Russian point that they've been pressing for some time, that pointing to the fact that there hasn't been any elections, as if to paint Zelensky as some sort of illegitimate authoritarian, which coming from Putin's government is quite rich and also absurd for the reasons that we've talked about, has been part of this kind of attempt to slowly kind of delegitimize the regime, to suggest it doesn't have popular support, even though going by polls it's still a fair amount of trust in Zelensky in that country. So it's I think everyone going into this knew where Trump and Trumpism and Trump world stood on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. They did want to bring it to an end as soon as possible, but I think there was a hope that even within that there would be something resembling a decent deal, from at least from the starting point of right now. This was a situation in which it was being kind of fought, as many people would read it, it had been fought to a stalemate. Both sides of the conflict were certainly kind of running out of steam, were ending up with tremendous losses, and that maybe there was a point here in which, even though it wouldn't have been what supporters of Ukraine and people within Ukraine would have wanted, that some kind of fragile peace might be carved out. The fact that we're hearing him indulging in this kind of idea that not only that Ukraine isn't America's problem, which is something you've heard on the American right for some time, but that actually Ukraine and Zelensky in particular are the villain of the piece, surely isn't encouraging, to put it mildly, about how these talks are going to go from here on.
And Jacob, what do you make of this argument that essentially the whole few years of Ukraine's resistance has all been a big waste of time, big waste of money, big waste of lives, and that, well, in Trump's words, he should have cut a deal straight away. Do you go along with any of that? I mean, it seems extraordinary.
Well, the line people keep saying, we got to stop this pointless war. It's a pointless war that can't go on and mustn't continue, all the rest of it, which it seems very, very strange for people who, in the kind of Trumpist orbit, who seem to go on so much about the importance of defending our freedoms and defending our sovereignty and retaking our kind of, that they're very happy to wage a war against the internal elite that governed America, and they did so to great effect, and we all enjoyed Vance's speech. But they don't seem to appreciate that the fight for national self-determination is kind of is an equally, if not more important kind of principle that should be defended. And there's this sense in which you do want to sometimes make a distinction. It's Trump, right? He likes sounding off, and then something else happens, so you have to distinguish the rhetoric from the reality a little bit. But it does seem that in this instance, what's happened is that the rhetoric has kind of run away from itself. And the problem is in international politics is that things that you say suddenly become facts and realities very, very quickly. And there is one thing to say, and many people support it, and sure, lots of Ukrainians support, we need to find a peace, right? One thing to say that, and even say that Ukraine needs to make some concessions on the road to that. But then the demand for elections in Ukraine, I mean, I thought America and the Trumpist wing of MAGA movement was against global democracy promotion and saw the kind of problems that they'd gone into with that in the past. But now that's seemingly back because Zelensky refused to sign the minerals deal that Trump had put in front of him. And as I say, the problem in international politics is that you're in danger of setting off kind of realities that maybe Trump is not capable of meeting. And so the whole context in which this is happening, of American seeming kind of rethinking its strategic priorities of whether it wants to kind of support Europe or be the guarantor of European security as much as before, suddenly you're in a very, very different world when you start playing it fast and loose. And I would be, for example, I mean, the whole questions about the Baltics, about Poland, about Europe more generally are thrown open by this. And it's certainly, to put it kind of mildly, not very encouraging when you have an approach that seems to be worked out on the fly, seems to be reliant on this kind of shadiest corners of Twitter that Elon Musk's worked hard to amplify. Zelensky's line that Trump seems to be trapped in a little bit of a bubble of misinformation. I probably wouldn't have said that if I was Zelensky, but is probably true. It certainly seems true in this case in terms of the facts and figures that Trump relates to. But the fundamental point seems to be that without any the attachment to the principles you'd like to see as the basis for this, the importance of national self-determination, the commitment to democracy as a fragile achievement, all things that we know that at least J.D. Vance is capable of talking about in a kind of inspiring and stirring fashion. You'd want that to be much more at the heart of policy here. And that doesn't mean you have to just go off and then adopt a kind of emotional European Union style, we as big supporters of values policy, but you want American foreign policy, which is important to all of us, to still have a commitment to the ideas that they say they actually commit.
It seems to me that those sections of the kind of anti-Ukraine right make a kind of fundamental error insofar as there's all kinds of merits to, say, the arguments that were well had out over recent decades over the potential folly of, say, NATO expansion. You know, it's a point that we've on Spiked made many times, that the kind of reckless way in which Western foreign policy either antagonised Russia or gives it a pretext to do what it did almost 3 years ago now. That's not the full explanation, of course. I think there's a tendency to almost act as if Russia has zero agency whatsoever in this. But that's an entirely legitimate point to make. It does not follow on from that first of all, that therefore, as soon as the tanks roll in, that you should just raise the white flag. It doesn't follow on from that Zelensky is some sort of sinister dictatorial figure. It doesn't follow on from that Ukraine should be treated with a degree. It's not just sort of disrespect. There's something almost vindictive to the things that are coming out at the moment. The grim spectacle of new kind of business ventures between the US and Russia being kind of discussed at the sidelines in Riyadh, as well as this reported sort of plan that's doing the rounds within the Trump administration, that a kind of cost would be imposed upon Ukraine that would be larger than that exacted from Germany for the Treaty of Versailles. I mean, this is only really makes sense if you spend a lot of time on those sections of X, as you describe, Jacob, where people are convinced not merely that Ukraine isn't America's problem, that this war has gone on for too long, that we need a peace at all costs, that America has bigger fish to fry, whatever, that it's actually something quite sinister is going on there with that government, and that they don't deserve solidarity, support, weapons, or anything else. Like, it just seems, because it's got so mangled into this very kind of crude, almost domestic political spat within the US, where it's kind of the current thing liberals on one side and the people who know the truth on the other, where Ukraine is concerned, that has now actually, at least where these comments are concerned, that whole atmosphere has intruded upon even these very serious negotiations to a degree that surely can't be good for Ukraine. Definitely.
And Jacob, one reason why all of this matters so much is because Europe can't step up to defend Ukraine. Europe has been asked to do that. The Trump administration wants to sort of rip off the Band-Aid, wants to cut Europe loose. They're saying we should get our act together, but we're simply not capable of doing it. That's why the US decisions have such an outsized influence. I mean, what have you made of America's comments towards Europe in that regard?
Yeah, well, people in Brussels kind of like to talk about wake-up calls. I've seen people refer to this as like, it's not wake-up calls is something you can keep silencing on your phone in the morning when you're a bit groggy, and that seems to be kind of what's going on here. But certainly the kind of strategic and geopolitical context in which this is happening is that for many decades, the question of what Europe's policy would be, does Europe want or need or is capable of an independent foreign policy? Does Europe have the kind of necessary economic and productive capabilities to create and sustain armies of the size that are needed in reality? All these questions have been allowed to be brushed under the carpet. People kind of looked at you like you're a wild-eyed loony if you're interested in military planning or army sizes, because that was also kind of passé, that belonged to a different era. And now we're in the era of the European Union and the peace that's kind of guaranteed by how nice we are to each other. And so this is a real, or ought to be, a real moment of recognition and realization for European countries and citizens right across Europe that we can no longer live in that kind of comfortable bubble, escaping from history. And in fact, something very profound and fundamental needs to change at the European level, in the sense of in every country right across Europe. And to that degree, that's why I say, like, on the one hand, you support some of the remarks of J.D. Vance, even if you think the Ukraine policy has slightly gone off the rails, whereby you need to say, fundamentally, this is the question of what does it mean to be patriotic? What does it mean to be a citizen of a country? And can we continue to sustain that kind of necessary attachment to our countries if, for example, our elites are so hostile to democracy, if they're obsessed on clamping down on everything that we say? And quite rightly, people begin to question their attachment to their country. So this ought to be a huge moment of shock to European elites. At the moment, though, it seems that certainly lots of the major ones are either mired in their own kind of navel gazing or keep repeating the lines that have been familiar to them of the past. And so you have to be slightly pessimistic about the possibility of Europe waking up at this moment.
And Tom, I did finally want to touch on the J.D. Vance speech a bit, because that was the other sort of rude awakening for Europeans, being told that, people have noticed that you are anti-democratic. The world has noticed that you are turning against free speech. And obviously, many of the European leaders have simply tried to deny that this is the case. But J.D. Vance had their number on that respect.
I thought it was fascinating that at the very same time that you had leaders in, say, Germany and Britain coming out to say this is absolute nonsense, of course we don't clamp down on freedom of speech, you had a bloke being arrested for burning a Koran and raids going on in Germany for people posting things on the internet. I mean, this is it's
there
almost
were 50 raids the weekend before.
Absurd. Like the level of gaslighting and dishonesty is tremendous. And I think it's also kind of telling that they don't even try to make a case for why we do things differently over here or what have you. I think people kind of recognise that a lot of the censorship which is going on at the moment in European countries, it's either nakedly politically motivated in some cases, trying to clamp down on kind of new populist insurgent movements, or it's a source of kind of shame. It's because of the fact that where an issue like Quran burnings exists, this has gotten completely away from governments. They haven't been able to get on top of this new kind of Islamist-style hysteria around these issues, and so would rather just kind of quietly censor people rather than deal with that fundamental problem. So he absolutely had their number. I just wish it didn't require a US vice president to make these points.
The two things are very actually related, the points made in Vance's speech and in a way the Ukraine issue, because there's a similar kind of deception going on both sides, where the European elites believe that what was going on in Ukraine was some kind of like something akin to the marches that they like funding in European capitals, where everybody's kind of engaged in some kind of kumbaya type politics. And similarly, American elites before the Trump administration believed that they were just kind of pulling the strings of a grateful Ukraine who was all going to be very happy for it. And Trump in a way has absorbed the same kind of self-importance that the Biden administration had towards Ukraine, thinks that there's no agency on behalf of the Ukrainian people. And both European elites are shocked to find out, for example, that Ukrainian nationalism is far more patriotic than they would be comfortable with. And Trumpists will be similarly surprised to find out that as difficult as the situation is in Ukraine, they're not going to take their fate lying down.
Definitely. Before we move on, though, I do just want to warn anyone who's in Germany, make sure, under no circumstances should you call the Green Party Vice-Chancellor a complete idiot. You must not call a Hamburg councillor a penis. And even an AfD politician managed to get someone fined for insulting them. So be careful, watch your words out there.
Please go out and do that.
Leave a comment and tell us. And
we will help
in the comment.
We will help crowdfund your defence.
This weekend is your last chance to apply for Spike's internship programme. If you think you've got a flair for journalism, if you're passionate about our pro-freedom politics, then this could be the opportunity for you. It's paid. It takes place in our London offices. You'll get to work on all the things we work on, from videos like this, podcasts, articles, essays, blogs, everything. No experience is necessary. What matters is that you're a fast learner, hard worker, and have got an eye for a great story. If that sounds like it could be for you, please go to spikes-online.com/interns to find out more and to apply. That's spikes-online.com/interns. Best of luck. So today we're recording this today. 4 caskets were released by Hamas. 4 dead Israeli hostages. 3 of them from the Bibas family. 1 of them the youngest hostages that Hamas took on October 7th. A baby that was just 9 months old, Kfir Bibas. Tom, this whole spectacle today was just the most gruesome and shocking reminder of the depravity and evil, dare I say, of Hamas.
No, absolutely. It was a grotesque spectacle, a grotesque anti-Semitic spectacle. It was like a kind of orgy of anti-Semitism, effectively. The delighting in effect, the parading around of these dead Israeli hostages who were taken for no other reason than they were Israeli and they were Jews, fundamentally. We shouldn't mix words about that. The fact that these were the youngest hostages that were taken, the fact that they were ever taken in the first place, the fact that when they were taken it was filmed and broadcast around the world for everyone to see. There's a grotesque, almost pornographic element to what Hamas did on October the 7th and since. And these awful little events, almost like somewhere between a kind of pep rally and a press conference, whenever hostages are released, dead or alive. In this instance, with the coffins being paraded, and other instances where you've got Israeli hostages holding up kind of goodie bags and certificates, something which maybe might fool a couple of the more credulous sort of Hamas apologists out there, but looks to everyone else, being filmed by balaclavaed Hamas videographers as the grotesque spectacle that it is. But many people, unfortunately, have come to the conclusion that the Bibas family, minus the father, who's actually been released alive a few weeks ago, were dead. The fact that this is something that people had kind of assumed by this point, it does underline the complete depravity of October the 7th in the first place, but also the depravity of the response across the West. I mean, images of baby Kafir's face were vandalised in the streets of Western capitals. People wrote colonizer on his face. There were various points in which people were making excuses for what took place. This is just taking of hostages in order to enter into negotiations. You're talking about a young family. And it's one of those things where I think it's because this conflict has been going on for so long, it's easy to become inured to what started it in the first place. You would hope, at least for the more honest people who aren't completely lost to all of the stuff that they've been reading on social media about this conflict in recent times, that it will be a point of reflection for them as to the excuses that have been made in some quarters for this group who've been parading around the coffins of babies over the last couple of days. This is who we were told were resistance fighters. Will there be that reassessment? Probably not, but it still needs marking, I think. Yeah,
Jacob, as Tom was alluding to, you know, the reaction of the West is almost as depraved and as frightening as the atrocity itself. The fact that so many people make excuses for this, perhaps even celebrate this, is something that we really have to confront head on.
Well, it's in some ways is remarkable to think into the minds of Hamas at this moment, where you had, as you say, this kind of entire legion of people across the West doing the rounds of saying that Hamas is something akin to a national liberation movement, that maybe they might have gone a bit far in a couple of cases, but really this is born out of a kind of genuine and reasonable struggle. And then you see these images, this grotesque ceremony that really is far more redolent of the worst crimes of ISIS that were broadcast on social media than anything else. And the degree of kind of disconnection and fundamentalism and absolute terror to think that you could broadcast these kinds of images, ISIS-level images, the iconography of everything, the black suits, the chilling coffins, and for people to see this and still not be able to reckon with the fact that of what this is really, you want to sit someone down who spent the last few years defending the actions of Hamas, or at least saying it's understandable, or in some case a kind of natural reaction or something, and show them what the reality of it is, which is the like with ISIS, a death cult that celebrates the most brutal and horrifying actions, seemingly as an end in themselves, right? There's no sense in which what has gone on has improved the lives of Palestinians and has made us a genuine settlement or a peace or a two-state solution or whatever you like. No sense in which any of this has become closer. Instead, it was kind of celebrated, it was initiated and celebrated by Hamas, seemingly for no other reason than it gave them the opportunity to kill Jews. And that's what this ceremony in its brutality and horrific kind of iconography really makes plain for us to see.
Tom, anything on that?
Well, I think there's been a lot of discussion about how, regrettably, whilst Hamas were always bound to lose, or at least take more losses in the actual kind of physical war, that they had kind of won the information war amongst a lot of Western publics, that young people in particular, though not exclusively, had been kind of won over to the very filtered and censored version of events which was coming out of Gaza, for instance. And I take that point. At the same time, you do wonder, this is the same Hamas which is also pumping out propaganda like this. This is the same Hamas that was also GoProing and live streaming their rape and murder and defilement of innocent Jews, many of them peace activists. It's the sort of thing where if they have won this information war whilst doing all of that, it does say something about the people who've become quite receptive to it. I know that there's such a thing as people kind of filter out information that doesn't support their case and tend to try and downplay the worst successes of what Hamas does. But you also have to come back to the question of maybe if there's a group that people are willing to make excuses for, whilst broadcasting its intentions to effectively wipe Israel off the map and murder as many Jews as it possibly can, whilst showing you video evidence of them doing so, delighting in doing so, taking, as I say, almost a kind of pornographic interest in broadcasting all of this to the world. If that's the group that you want to make excuses for, maybe you haven't just been hoodwinked, maybe you are just anti-Semitic. And that's one thing which has always been undergirding this. But I cannot comprehend how people can accept that, say, that spectacle in Gaza this week happened and not recognise the grand folly of not even supporting, but even making excuses for the people who are putting it on.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.